This is South Africa. Located at the tip of the African continent, South Africa is rich in natural beauty. It's also the place of my birth and the country I was raised in. The first modern humans are believed to have inhabited South Africa more than 100,000 years ago. The First Nations of South Africa are collectively referred to as the Khoisan, the Khoikhoi and the San separately. These groups were displaced or sometimes absorbed by migrating Africans or Bantus during the Bantu expansion from Western and Central Africa. European exploration of the African coast began in the 13th century when Portugal committed itself to discover an alternative route to the Silk Road that would lead to China. In the 14th and 15th century, Portuguese explorers traveled down the West African coast, detailing and mapping the coastline, and in 1488 they rounded the Cape of Good Hope. The Dutch East India Company established a trading post in Cape Town under the command of Jan van Riebeeck in 1652. European workers who settled at that cape became known as freeburgers and gradually established farms in the Dutch Cape Colony. Bantu expansion. The Bantu originated in western equatorial Africa and migrated down through the continent. During a wave of expansion that began 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, Bantu-speaking populations, today some 310 million people, gradually left their original homeland of West Central Africa and traveled to the eastern and southern regions of the continent. Using data from a vast genomic analysis of more than 2,000 samples taken from individuals in 57 populations throughout sub-Saharan Africa, scientists from the Institute Pasteur and the CNRS, together with a broad international consortium, have retraced the migratory routes of these populations. Their research reveals that the admixture that occurred as a result of successive encounters with local populations enabled the Bantus to acquire genetic mutations that helped them adapt to their new environments. Finally, by analyzing the genomes of more than 5,000 African Americans, the scientists have identified the genetic origins of African populations deported as slaves and confirmed that the blight of Benin and West Central Africa were the main ports used for the slave trade to North America. This research was published on May the 5th in the journal Science. Some 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, the emergence of farming marked a major turning point in African history. Mastering this new skill enabled Bantu speakers, previously hunter-gatherers living in the region between Cameroon and Nigeria, to gradually leave their homeland and spread to new areas. This was the start of a millennia-long journey that resulted in these populations settling throughout sub-Saharan Africa. Further east, Bantu-speaking communities had reached the Great Central African Rainforest, and by 500 BCE, pioneering groups had emerged into the savannas to the south in what are now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Angola, and Zambia. Another stream of migration moving east by 1000 BCE was creating a major new population center near the Great Lakes of East Africa. Pioneering groups had reached modern KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa by CE 300 along the coast, and the modern Limpopo province, formerly northern Transvaal, by 500 CE. Before the expansion of farming and pastoralist African peoples, southern Africa was populated by hunter-gatherers and earlier pastoralists. The Bantu expansion first introduced Bantu peoples to Central, Southern, and Southeast Africa, regions they had previously been absent from. The Proto-Bantu migrants in the process assimilated and or displaced a number of earlier inhabitants. The relatively powerful Bantu-speaking states on a scale larger than local chiefdoms began to emerge in the regions when the Bantu people settled from the 13th century onward. By the 19th century, groups with no previous distinction gained political and economic prominence. The Bantu are immigrants to southern Africa, the same as everyone else, other than the Khoi and San, who were indigenous to southern Africa and who were displaced by the Bantu. The Khoi were once the kings of the planet. The Bantu migrated from the Great Lakes in Central Africa and landed up in Southern Africa. The Khoi and San had been there for some time already. In fact, at one stage their numbers had been larger. Some 22,000 years ago they were the largest group of humans on Earth. About 10,000 years ago there were not more than 1 million people on the planet. Today only about 100,000 Khoisan, who are also known as Bushmen, remain. We are seeing the end of their culture and their hunter-gatherer lifestyle, which is being replaced by herding and agriculture. In Botswana, there is a law that the hunter-gatherers cannot hunt anymore. There are land disputes, and in many cases they are being pushed off the land they once used to hunt on or consider sacred. They are considered lowlifes in society and have very little political representation. In South Africa, the Bantu have relegated the original inhabitants of Southern Africa, the San and the Khoi, to people whose voices are drowned out, their claims to the land denied and silenced in favor of Bantu kings and chiefs who were immigrants to Southern Africa. The first people on the land in South Africa were the Khoi and the San. The differences between the San and the Bantu. The San are particularly thought of as foragers in the Kalahari Desert and regions of Botswana, Namibia, Angola, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, and northern South Africa. The word San is from the Kuku language and simply refers to foragers, those who pick things up from the ground, who do not own livestock. The Bantu are not the same as the San. The Bantu keep cattle and do not have the same knowledge as the Khoi and the San. Many Khoisan peoples are the direct descendants of a very early dispersal of anatomically modern humans to southern Africa before 150,000 years ago. It is suggested that the ancestors of the modern Khoisan expanded to southern Africa from East or Central Africa before 150,000 years ago, possibly as early as before 260,000 years ago, so that by the beginning of the megadrought 130,000 years ago, there were two ancestral population clusters in Africa, bearers of mtDNA haplogroup LO in southern Africa ancestral to the Khoisan, and bearers of haplogroup Li6 in Central Asia, Africa ancestral to everyone else. This group gave rise to the San population of hunter-gatherers. Their nearest living relatives are postulated to be the Hadzabe people from north-central Tanzania and Mbuti pygmies from the eastern Congo. A much later wave of migration around or before the beginning of the Common Era gave rise to the Ku people, who were pastoralists. This group carried DNA from Eurasian as well as Neanderthal groups. Due to the early expansion and separation, the populations ancestral to the Khoisan have been estimated as having represented the largest human population during the majority of the anatomically modern human timeline, from their early separation before 150 Kea until the recent peopling of Eurasia, some 70 Kea. They were much more widespread than today, their modern distribution being due to the decimation in the course of the Bantu expansion. They were dispersed through much of southern and southeastern Africa. South Africa's growing black population creates a problem, a land issue and a resources issue. There aren't enough jobs, resources and land for the growing numbers of people. But there's so much land, you say. No, there isn't. We need to mark places for nature reserves to protect the animals and the plants. Some of the land is remote. Some of the land is water scarce. Much of the land is owned by government. We need land for large-scale farming to feed the nation. Some of the land is for mining. Much of the land is owned by tribal chiefs. The growing population is a huge problem and will continue to create issues if the population doesn't start reducing. There are simply not enough jobs and resources for the Bantu, and this is one of the causes of poverty. In the next slide, you'll see the total population of South Africa in 2022 by ethnic groups. As of 2022, South Africa's population increased and counted approximately 60.6 million inhabitants in total, of which the majority, roughly 49.1 million, were Black Africans. Individuals with an Indian or Asian background formed the smallest population group, of approximately 1.56 million people overall. Looking at the population from a regional perspective, Gauteng is the smallest province of South Africa, though highly urbanized with a population of nearly 16 million people. So why is Africa poor? Within Africa, Most poverty is concentrated in the sub-Saharan African region. Central Africa has the highest extreme poverty rate of 54.8, followed by Southern Africa at 45.1%. Rates in Western and Eastern Africa are 36.8 and 33.8 respectively. North Africa met their SDG target of a poverty rate below 3% in 2019. Africa's inability to reduce its high extreme poverty rate has been attributed to numerous factors. One is the over-reliance on natural resources for growth instead of agriculture and rural development, which characterizes 85% of African livelihoods. The high initial poverty levels, coupled with low asset ownership and restricted access to public services, also make it difficult for households to take advantage of growth. Second, bad governance, corruption, and high income inequality also drive up poverty. In 2018, more than half of South Africans, or 30 million people, lived below the national poverty line of 992 rands a month. This number increased since 2011. The groups worst affected by poverty are Black South Africans, the unemployed, the less educated, female-headed households, large families, and children. The official unemployment rate was 27.7% in the third quarter of 2017, while youth unemployment was 38.6%. Land has always been mentioned as one of the reasons for poverty, so we're going to investigate the history of this in South Africa and see if land is the reason for poverty. The World Bank South African Director Paul Numa said, South Africa has a dual economy where on the one hand is a small, high-skilled, high-productivity economy, and on the other hand, a large, low-skilled, low-productivity economy. South Africa has many issues that need to be overcome in order to alleviate the poverty issue. In this series of videos, we're going to look at a few issues that contributed to poverty and look at how these issues can be addressed. In today's series, we are going to look at the land issue, which is part of the reason for the poverty. The land issue is ongoing in South Africa, but the reality is that large populations need food. South Africa has a large population and land is needed to grow food for the population, but Black South Africans want the land for the purposes of living on and subsistence farming. A country that has no arable land for large-scale farming becomes food unstable and eventually lands up importing food instead of producing it locally. The land reform process saw large farms that were producing food and employing many handed to black unskilled farmers or workers on the farms. Farming was not as easy as they thought, and so when it came to food production, there was a high failure rate, which saw South Africa's food production decline and food become more expensive. There's a common belief in the myth in South Africa that the Natives Land Act of 1913 shoved blacks onto reserves and prohibited them from buying land in white areas, that whites forcibly removed blacks to these reserves, and that these reserves were on the worst land in the country with no mineral riches, and that whites kept all the best land and minerals for themselves. First of all, the biggest platinum reserves in the world run through the former black homeland of Maputo, Tswana in the Northwest Province. The former nationalist government had no problem allocating this area to the Tswana tribes for self-rule, although they already had a massive country called Botswana given to them by the British. It was originally part of South Africa called Bechuanaland. Black people also had two massive countries from the British called Lesotho and Swaziland. Tribal life. Black South Africans lived in tribes governed by chiefs or tribal leaders. The common belief is that the black tribes at the time were all living peacefully and in the spirit of Ubuntu with each other in a virtual literal paradise. Nothing could be further from the truth. Shaka Zulu wiped out some 2 million black people in the Diffakani. Shaka at the time was committing genocide against other tribes, wiping out an estimated 2 million people in what is now known as the Diffakani or the Great Scattering. The Swazis and the Ndebele's fled north in the direction of Central Africa, where they migrated from. The Sutus fled into the mountains of what is today Lesotho. The rest of the smaller tribes huddled together, trying to find strength and coalescing. That is the history of black South Africans that blacks prefer to ignore. It is into this maelstrom of black chaos that the Boers trekked in 1838. As far as they went, they found large open sections of country uninhabited by anyone. Black tribes fleeing Shaka's carnage grouped themselves into areas finding protection in concentrated numbers. This is how Sir Theophilus Shepstone later found the remnants of black refugees huddled together on self-created reserve. He just demarcated it in order to protect them from each other. We are now going to look at the Bantu migration into South Africa. The Bantu migration took the form of successive waves of small tribes representing 4 different black ethnic groups, the Nguni, the Sotho, the Venda, and the Tonga, responding to the push and pull of economic conditions and tribal conflicts. These migratory tribes simply moved to wherever nature offered most and enemies threatened least. Among these tribes, the modern Western concept of a geopolitically defined country and land ownership was practically unknown. I've included a slide here about how much the South African government spent on the development of the traditional tribal homelands for self-rule in the period in which they governed. It amounted to $558 million. We are now going to take a brief look at the Zulus, which will feed into the later slides. The Zulus are the largest tribe in South Africa. Shaka was born in 1787. He was the founder of the Zulu Empire. He served as a warrior for 6 years under the reign of Dingiswayo, the Mtetwa's chief. Dingiswayo was impressed by Shaka's courage and endurance. Shaka remained with the Mtetwa until he learnt of the death of his father, Senza Khona, in 1816. Shaka claimed his father's chieftaincy with military assistance from Dingiswayo. With his experience learned from the Mtetwa, he transformed his clan's military from a largely ceremonial force into a powerful army capable of both defense and aggression. In 1880, Shaka's mentor, Dingiswayo, was assassinated by Zwide, the chief of the Ndwani clan. Shaka sought revenge and received it in 1820 with the Zulus' victory over the Ndwani in the Battle of Malhlutse River. Shaka then set out to forge the various Zulu-speaking clans into a powerful empire. As he incorporated rival groups, the Zulu Empire's population reached an estimated 250,000, and his state emerged as the largest in the history of Southern Africa. In 1827, at the height of his power, Shaka could order the field of battle over 50,000 warriors and controlled most of the area that is now the modern state of South Africa. As an aside, most of the Zulu tribe were not originally Zulus. Their previous tribes were murdered by Shaka, and they were assimilated into the Zulu tribe, thereby losing their original identity. From 1835 onwards, nearly a quarter of the Cape's white population left the colony in a series of organized movements collectively known as the Great Trek. The movement coursed over vast tracts of empty land, areas that had been inhabited by migratory Bantu tribes had become depopulated as a result of the Mfokani, a series of black, specifically Zulu, reigns of terror. For nearly a quarter of the century, there was an era of warfare characterized by the most appalling bloodshed and devastation. The impis of the Zulu king Shaka reigned supreme in Natal and even penetrated the Transvaal across the Drakensberg Mountains, leaving a trail of destruction, exterminating or dispersing all other tribes within which they came into contact. Shaka was not the only ruler responsible for this kind of destruction. Mzilikazi, one of his former lieutenants, broke away from the Zulu king and established a following of his own, the Matabele tribe. The Afrikaner trekkers who moved into Natal encountered various Zulu tribes. In February 1838, Piet Retief, the leader of the trekkers, negotiated with Dingaan, the Zulu king and successor to Shaka, and obtained from him a document granting the trekkers the place called Port Natal, together with all the land from the Tugela to the Umzimvumbu rivers. Before Retief and his party could return to their people, they were murdered in Dingaan's kraal. The written contract was, however, retrieved by the trekkers and still exists today. Shaka's actions became simultaneously more tyrannical, ruthless, and bizarre as power concentrated in his hands. In 1827, at the height of his power, his mother Nandi died. Anger over her death and over her and his treatment at the hands of the Elangeni led him to order the massacre of thousands of tribal members. His brutal treatment of his own army nearly led to its mutiny. The pattern of the Mfokani, in which tribe was set against tribe, over an ever-increasing radius, was highly successful in areas weakened by overpopulation and overgrazing. In South Africa itself, the Mfecane caused immense suffering and devastated large areas as refugees scrambled to safety in mountain fastness or were killed, thus easing the way for white expansion into Natal and the Highveld. In the Cape Colony, it greatly increased pressures on the eastern frontier as refugees known as Mfengu crowded in on the peoples of the Transkei. At the same time, however, as a result of the Mfecane, some of the most formidable kingdoms to oppose white penetration were created: the Sotho, the Swazi, the Ndebele, as well as the Gaza of Mozambique. The impact of the Mfecane was felt far beyond South Africa, as peoples fled from Shaka's armies as far as Tanzania and Malawi in the northeast, the Ngoni and Barotse land in Zambia to the northwest, the Kololo. For an entire century, unaware of the existence of black tribes, Afrikaner families who have mostly already been born on African soils expanded their settlement to over 170,000 square kilometers, more than twice the size of Austria, of desolated and unoccupied land. Only towards the end of the 16th century did the Afrikaner farmers increasingly come into contact with black tribes. In the 1770s, some of 1,000 kilometers to the northeast of Cape Town, the Afrikaner migratory stream came into substantial contact with a vanguard of another migratory movement, namely the Xhosa-speaking tribe. They were the advance guard of a black migratory movement from the vicinity of the Great Lakes of Central Africa. It would appear that by the end of the 15th century, these tribes had moved as far as present-day Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique. They probably crossed into the present-day Republic of South Africa appreciable numbers in the course of the 17th century, at about the same time as the Afrikaner free farmers settlement was expanding inland from the Cape of Good Hope. The black population movement into the area, which later became known as British South Africa, did not constitute a single coherent expansion. By 1950, the government had banned mixed marriages. In order to limit contact between the races, the government established separate public facilities for whites and non-whites, limited the activity of non-white labor unions, and denied non-white participation in national government. In one of the most devastating aspects of apartheid, the government forcibly removed black South Africans from rural areas designated as white to the homelands and sold their land at low prices to white farmers. From 1961 to 1994, more than 3.5 million people were forcibly removed from their homes and deposited in the Bantustans, where they were plunged into poverty and hopelessness. We are now going to look at the black homelands. When one compares the rainfall map of South Africa, and anybody with elementary knowledge of South Africa will tell you that the largest part of South Africa is called the Karoo. The Karoo is a semi-desert comparable to Arizona or Nevada in the USA. Black people never entered this area, let alone settled it. White people made it blossom and created successful sheep farms producing meat of the world quality. Black settlements are found on the north and east coast of South Africa. The east coast has a subtropical climate and the north a prairie-like climate with summer rainfall and thunderstorms. An exception to this is the Western Cape with a Mediterranean climate and winter rainfall. The northern and eastern part of South Africa with its beautiful green grasslands and fertile soil is where the blacks eventually coalesced, and this is the land they chose for themselves. Their eventual homelands were found on the land they inhabited out of their own free will. The Afrikaners even have a song praising the greenness of Natal called Groen is die land van Natal. Green is the land of Natal. It was perfect grazing area for the cattle herding black people. The rainfall map clearly shows this. The next slide shows you the rainfall patterns in South Africa. You can also find this information online should you wish to. During apartheid, black South Africans were allocated to homelands. 4 tribal homelands, Bophuthatswana, Ciscoe, the Transkei, and Venda, have been declared independent by the South African government. Why weren't the Bantustans a success? Let's look at the truth and the lies. The Bantustans were meant to be autonomous, but they failed. The people overused the land, causing soil erosion, and their useless, corrupt leaders also caused the failure of the Bantustans. The failure of the Bantustans was due to a lack of investment in them and their own leadership's incapability to form a coherent economic policy. With the exception of Botswana, most predominantly relied on subsistence agriculture and remittances from guest workers in the cities. Most were effectively controlled like chiefdoms, with the chief at the top effectively taking rent from his subjects, with lots of corruption and very little in return for the citizens. Pretoria, interestingly enough, invested quite a bit in the homelands, often plugging huge gaps in their budget to provide what basic services the Bantustans had. Today, South Africa is blighted by the same corruption and mismanagement as the Bantustans were during apartheid. The poverty is related to the system of chiefs in the black community. Do away with chiefs and tribal leaders and the people will thrive. Institutional arrangements inherited from the Bantustan era place rural people under the thumbs of imposed chiefs, even when they act without statutory authority. Examples of this include people living in the former homelands do not have formal addresses. Without a proof of residence letter from their local traditional council, it's impossible to get an ID book, a child support grant, a pension, a car license, a bank account, or to have a body released for burial. Those who don't pay annual and ad hoc tribal levies are refused proof of address letters. There has been a resurgence in these levies since 2004 to 2005, even though they are not legally sanctioned, except in Limpopo. In many areas, government departments won't release development money for agriculture or infrastructure without the chief's approval. Chiefs routinely ban committee meetings in some areas, arguing that only they have the power to convene meetings. The Eastern Cape government is replacing previously elected headmen with hereditary headmen, despite opposition from communities. The problem is clearly traditional leaders. Traditional leaders insist that customary law forbids independent rights in the former Bantustans. Their pressure has resulted in the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform withholding title deeds from rural groups who won restitution claims and compensation for forced removal, even in cases where the relevant minister has signed the transfer agreements. At the Land Divided Conference in March, the Minister of the Department, Gugele Nkwati, confirmed that the 1996 Communal Property Associations Act would be amended to stop the transfer of title to communal property associations in the former homelands. According to Nkwati, it makes no sense for communities within communities to have title to the land. 100 years after the Land Act denied black land ownership, the ANC government is supporting traditional leaders in upholding this tradition. Now, as in the past, a ruling elite has reached for the law to bolster its contested authority and monopolize land and other resources at the expense of the poorest. Although the former homelands are characterized by desperate poverty, they also have significant mineral deposits, including platinum and coal. People in northwest Limpopo and Mpumalanga often protest against traditional leaders refusing to account for lucrative mining deals. When poor people turn to government in these cases, they receive no support. Instead, Parliament enacts laws that reimpose contested tribal identities and subject rural people to the very chiefs that they challenge. So how do we address the land issue? The ANC is guilty of corruption. It benefits from the support of tribal leaders at the expense of the people. The only way this will change is if the black community stops voting for the ANC, removes tribal leaders, and stops the practices of chiefs and tribal leaders. Tribal land should be taken away from tribal leaders and sold to the people. Title deeds should be given to the people who buy the land. No chief or tribal leader should own land on behalf of a tribe. We are now going to look at Botswana, which was one of the Bantustans. Botswana was the legally designated homeland for the Republic of South Africa Tswana people. The Tswana settled in the area about 1600. The region suffered from war started by Shaka, the founder of the Zulu Empire, and from famine between 1822 and 1837. The resulting migrations led to the formation of subgroups of Tswana and new settlements. Most of Botswana's semi-arid terrain was used for grazing beef and dairy cattle, while the scarce arable land supported corn, maize, sorghum, wheat, and peanuts. The Republic's small-scale industries produced beverages, processed tobacco, textiles, wood products, and leather goods. In the picture that you see in the slide is Sun City, which is established in Botswana and creates quite a bit of employment in the area. The next Bantustan we're looking at is called the Ciscoe. The Ciscoe was a Bantustan for the Xhosa people located in the southeast of South Africa. It covered an area of 7,700 square kilometers. I've included a few pictures of the Ciscoe in this slide. You can search more photos of the Ciscoe online. After the Union of South Africa formed in 1910, the Bantu rights of occupation remained unclear and differed from colony to colony within South Africa. The Native Lands Act of 1913 demarcated the reserves in the Union and made it illegal to sell or lease these lands to Europeans, except in the Cape Colony. The next Bantustan we're going to look at is the Transkei. The Transkei was a Bantustan for the Xhosa people. I've included some photos of the beautiful Transkei in the photos below. You can see there's lots of natural beauty there. It's green and lush. Sky is still largely rural. Subsistence farmers eke out a living from tiny backyard plots, and livestock roams freely across the region's gentle rolling hills. The Transkei is home to some of South Africa's most spectacular scenery, including dramatic cliffs, serene rivers, and uninterrupted stretches of golden sand. Consequently, it's the perfect destination for those with a passion for outdoor pursuits, including fishing, surfing, hiking, and game viewing. Infrastructure is basic here, and part of the charm is in leaving civilization behind. However, there are backpacker lodges, rustic beach resorts, and elegant old hotels strung along the coast at various strategic points. Each of these places is defined by a relaxed vibe that transports visitors back to a less complicated era. Allegations that the homelands were barren are clearly untrue, as you can see from the photos that I've shared. I've also included a link to a YouTube video that you can watch which shows footage of the Transkei. So black South Africans weren't shoved onto use this land. They were given rich arable land from which they could have created farms and even businesses, but they didn't. Instead, they relied on the South African government. The rhetoric today is still that most of the land in the Bantustans is not suitable for farming. But is that really the reality? I've included in the next slide a map of South Africa and regions of unsuitable, marginally suitable, moderately suitable, and highly suitable land. You'll see very clearly the areas of land on the map. So if you would like to, you can do more research. I've also included a brief slide of Southwest Africa and Bantustans created in Southwest Africa, but we're not going to be discussing this in this video today. Squatter camps. Since people need to live close to cities, they form squatter camps. Now some 2.2 million households, or 14% of the national total, had resided in these squatter camps in 2017. These camps are scattered all over South Africa and reveal a lack of affordable housing for many South Africans. The government could have built decent tiny homes where the squatter camps stand, but they have ignored the camps and done nothing to improve the lives of the people living there. Over 30 years, government has allowed the squatter camp situation to become a crisis. The housing minister has failed to address the issue with meaningful solutions. Government could have created thriving, decent communities with decent services, but they have failed to do so. Farming in South Africa. Subsistence farming, or subsistence agriculture, is when a farmer grows food for themselves and their family on a small plot of land. For many people living in wealthy countries, this is a romantic idea, having land and using it to sustain you and your family. It calls back to what people might assume was a simpler time. As charming as the idea is in developed countries, the reality is that at this point in time, industrial farming is necessary to feed our expanding human population. Most black South Africans are subsistence farmers. Higher food and overall costs eat into people's incomes and therefore make them poorer. As a continent, according to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, Africa imported about 85% of its food from outside the continent, amounting to 35 billion, and it's expected to reach 110 billion by 2025. According to a report released by Statistics South Africa measuring food security in South Africa, applying the food insecurity experience scale, almost 23.6% of South Africans were affected by moderate to severe food insecurity, while almost 14.9% experienced severe food insecurity. There's a Stats SA link which you can follow for more information on this subject. We're now going to take a look at land reform in South Africa. Land reform was one of the flagship policies that Mandela's political party, the African National Congress, instituted after apartheid's end. It set up a process to buy whites out of their farms and pass them to black people. The ambitious goal was set to transfer at least 30% of South Africa's white-owned agricultural land to black people. The ANC began by focusing on returning land to those they termed beneficiaries, the descendants of black people pushed off land to make way for the mechanized farms. In theory, this was the most direct reparation for the way land was stolen from black people. In practice, it quickly created two huge new problems. Groups numbering into the thousands were resettled on plots that had been owned by a single white family. Many quarreled over its management, sometimes to the death. The descendants of those deprived of rural land were also the least likely to have received the kind of education necessary to run a high-tech farm in a globalized marketplace. Some couldn't read, many hadn't finished high school. Receiving a mechanized farm that immediately demanded the implementation of a computerized marketing plan for exporting the produce to Europe was impossible. They never had the skills. Black farming initiatives. We are grateful we got the land. Daniel, a former mine worker in his 70s, now the de facto manager of a black-owned lychee plantation, told me when I visited him. Having none of the relevant technical experience, he couldn't make the farm generate revenue and was now practically starving. We know we are suffering because we ourselves are not correctly utilizing the land. Many farms where black people took ownership failed. The hope that black people would be able to lift themselves out of poverty via land ownership became a faded dream as more and more black farms failed to even feed their inhabitants. Recently, there is a reason for hope, though. The reason for this hope is a mentorship program started by white farmers on their own in order to help black farmers. This is not a government program, and government has not helped in any way. This was a program started by white farmers on their own initiative. The initiative was started by Grain SA. See the link below for more details on this story. The Grain SA program gives the subsistent farmers access to 90 of South Africa's most successful commercial farmers who serve as their mentors. From the negative newspaper headlines comes a public perception that farming is divided and that the story of land is one of heartache, anger, and resentment. But for the past 20 years, the farmers of Grain SA have looked deep into their own souls and reached out even deeper into their communities to try to prove that farmers have their own solution to land reform. And they're making it work. With a 25 million a year operational budget and managing a further 120 million worth of projects on a farming development program that is changing lives. This development program, a privately funded collective through Grain SA, is aimed entirely at new black farmers. It now supports 12,859 black subsistence farmers, half of whom are women, from 9 offices nationwide, and it has created 171 new black commercial farmers producing 250 tons or more of maize annually. Farmers like Jeremiah Matabula. The story of millies and tractors and bakkies. It's the story of the 12,859. It's a story that begins on 1 hectare of land deep in the rural Eastern Cape. It's a story that's been there for 20 years now, but which you've not been told. There on that 1 hectare of land is everything that South Africa can be. And there are 12,859 black farmers on their 1 hectare of land who are what the story is all about. It's also the story of Jeremiah Matabula, who's last year's Grain SA Farmer of the Year. He's one of the 171 new black commercial farmers who are also the most positive story in South African farming and land reform that you've not heard of. This is not window dressing, Matabula says emphatically. I won't go for that. I'm the product of a white commercial farmer, Mr. Peter Forster, who mentored me on grain farming. I've seen how farmers are willing to help, but unfortunately these good stories don't travel as quickly. The 12,859 and the 171 represent a 20-year investment of pure passion and faith by the farmers who fall under the auspices of Grain SA to achieve the one thing they all believe in. We have a strong belief that the farming community can heal one another and heal the country, says Jannie de Villiers, the Chief Executive of Grain SA. Changing lives. You change that person's life permanently because now he or she is not just living from hand to mouth, but actually making a profit by selling, says de Villiers, who leads the development programs team. I've asked these women farmers what they did with the extra money they earned. It brings you to tears. One old woman told me she bought herself a bed. She'd never slept on a bed in her life. Another bought a fridge and another new school uniforms for her kids. That's how farming alleviates poverty. These are the untold stories of farming in South Africa. That's the real story of land reform no one is telling you. And that's why we say agriculture can heal South Africa. Because I've seen how these farmers bond with their communities around farming and are helping one another. The subsistence farmers we support plant only 30% of their land because they cannot get blank loans to grow their operation. They work on communal land, so they have no title deeds, and that means they have no security to offer to bank to get finance to grow their potential, de Villiers says. The National Credit Act says you cannot loan to anybody who has no security, and these farmers can offer no security without title deeds for the land they're on, so we cannot help them get this land into full production for their benefit. We can only help them to use 30% of their land while the rest just lies fallow. That's not real landform, and that's what we're campaigning to change. We have vast tracts of untapped communal land that we can develop to the benefit of these communities long before we get to the commercial farming land. We can solve this thing. If you give these thousands of subsistence farmers on communal land title deeds, you transform farming in South Africa right there. My note here is that the issue here is with government not giving these farmers title deeds to the land. So while the headlines and politicians might tell only part of the story of South African farming, there's a 1-hectare piece of land in the Eastern Cape where a commercial farmer and an old Xhosa woman are telling the other side of the story. And the seeds they're planting together are quietly growing into a new story on an African farm. At the moment, we've reached a great opportunity where black and white farmers are coming together to make sure the farming community of South Africa works, says Matabula. On the ground, we work together. The white commercial farmers have the experience and they can and are willing to transfer. Color is not an issue for us. It's about being productive on our land and feeding the nation. I've worked with people of all races in farming, and we are coming together like never before to make the farming community better, starting with skills transfer and programs like the ones Grain SA is running. Driven by their belief to use farming to heal South Africa rather than divide it, Grain SA sponsors mobile units that travel into the most rural communities to offer clinics to teach skills such as welding, grinding, and painting, as well as how to service a tractor or repair farm equipment. The program has spawned a partnership with the Science and Technology Department to develop small portable threshers so that these farmers can harvest their crops without having to work their thumbs till they bleed. And another partnership with Ciscoe provides these farmers with bags for their harvest so that it doesn't lie on the ground where it's subject to mold that can cause illness. But most importantly, this program gives the subsistence farmers access to 90 of South Africa's most successful commercial farmers who serve as their mentors. They travel by bakkie deep into those communities with the sole aim of helping an old black woman barely surviving on 1 ton of maize a year from her 1 hectare of land, and using their science and their expertise to make that same piece of land yield up to 8 tons of maize a year. My next slide is about farmers leaving farming. Kuto, because of business interests, was able to obtain a loan to buy his farm, but other blacks are dependent on a government program that will purchase land on their behalf. The trouble is, according to some farmers I met today, the purchasing procedure is so long and cumbersome that buyers get tired of waiting and sell their acreage to someone else with ready cash. I've attached the link to the story I got this from in the slide. 1 in 5 farmers in South Africa plans to leave the sector in the next decade, research shows. Stellenbosch University PhD graduate Candace Clutis research investigating farm-level exit decisions and exit rates in commercial agriculture in South Africa, looks into the various reasons farmers plan to leave the sector. Next, we're going to look at some more about the land issue. There's been allegations that 80% of the population occupy less than 10% of the land. I've given you some links that you can do some research on. The EFF bases its claim on ownership data and the size of the African and colored population. The party's national communications manager, Ciscoe, sorry, I can't pronounce his name, explained how it was calculated. But are the EFF's calculations correct? I've attached their calculations, and I'm going to do a little discussion on this. Is 67% of the SA land white-owned agricultural land? In 1993, the year before South Africa's first democratic election, a Stats SA agricultural census estimated the country had about 82 million hectares of agricultural land. The government has referred to this land as white-owned agricultural land. The 67% was commercial farmland historically reserved for white ownership, but it shouldn't be assumed to be the share in white hands today, because since 1994, black people have acquired some of this land through private sales and loans. An Agri-SA land audit estimated that white farmers owned 68.5 million hectares of agricultural land in 2016. This includes land owned by companies and trusts and amount to 56% of total land. Agricultural economist Wandile gave Africa Check an estimate of agricultural land not owned by white people. It identifies 17.5 million hectares of farmland as not owned by whites. It's made up of agricultural land owned by the state, redistributed and restored land, and a guesstimate of the land bought by willing black buyers from willing white sellers. It also includes a hectare equivalent of money paid in land restitution claims. I've included in this slide a little bit about the ANC's land redistribution program and whether or not it was a success or not. You can read a little bit about the article. So how much farmland do white South Africans own then? 64.8 million hectares of farmland. 53% of total land is owned by white people, and as white farmers leave farming, this number will drop below 50%. There's a slide on the land that was redistributed. You can look at the totals and the figures. The problem is hugely emotional in South Africa, where the majority of black people still live in poverty despite 17 years of black rule. In neighboring Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe's government tried to solve the same problem by forcibly evicting around 5,000 white farmers from their farmland. Even though Zimbabwe's policy has been an unmitigated economic disaster, some influential politicians in South Africa have advocated doing the same, which is utter madness. Addressing the problem yesterday, Mr. Nkwinti said, "In our country, we wanted to solve it yesterday, but that's not possible. So we think it's going to take a bit of time and will require patience." Studies of the South African model have shown that as many as 90% of the new black-run farms fail because the new owners do not have the experience of running a large enterprise. I've provided you with another slide which you can read at your own leisure about how we calculate the percentage of land that is owned by black people and white people. I'm not going to read through this now. And then the next slide is about the target for land reform, which based on the ANC is a shifting sand. They changed the metrics for for redistribution with every passing year. Again, you can read through the article that I've attached. And so who owns what? We're going to look at that again. An analysis of where black-owned land is situated shows that not less than 80% of that land is in the high rainfall zone. Apportioning it on this basis means the total agricultural potential of the land is 7.4 million LSUs. The white-owned agricultural land amounts to 75 million hectares. I'm just going to skip further down. In other words, when land in South Africa is measured by its true value, it becomes clear that black people already own nearly 48% of the country's agricultural potential. You can read through the slide at your leisure. So what is the way forward in regards to land in South Africa? It's clear the only way South Africa can thrive is to vote out the ANC, do away with traditional leaders and chiefs, reduce the population numbers and control immigration, remove BBEEE and affirmative action, remove tribal lands and give secure tenure to those who want to buy the tribal lands so that they no longer have to rent the land from chiefs who become wealthy while the people become poor. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like, comment, and subscribe.